The hall had not been built for humility. Tavian noticed this immediately, though he had been trying very hard not to notice anything at all. The ceiling stretched upward until it seemed less like architecture and more like a polite suggestion to the stars beyond. Light moved through the space in layers, each one slower than the last, as if photons themselves required time to consider their trajectory in a place like this. Every surface hummed, not loudly, not even audibly really, but the vibration lived in the bones of anyone who stood still long enough to feel it. Tavian had the distinct impression that the building was aware of him in ways he was not entirely comfortable with. He was 32 years old. He had survived 7 diplomatic postings across 4 systems. He had learned through careful observation and several near-catastrophic mistakes that the safest position in any alien court was precisely between important and forgettable. Tonight, he had achieved that balance perfectly. His seat placed him 3 tables from the sovereign's dais, close enough to signal relevance, far enough to avoid direct attention. The other guests were a carefully curated mixture of species and status, their conversations flowing in languages his translator implant rendered as a soft murmur of political niceties and veiled threats. Tavian focused on his plate. The food appeared to be both liquid and architecturally sound, which violated several laws of physics he had once believed were immutable. He prodded it gently with something that might have been a utensil. The substance quivered. He set the utensil down. This was fine. Everything was fine. He would sit here, nod occasionally at the official and beside him and who was explaining the fermentation properties of asteroid-grown fruit with alarming enthusiasm, and then leave without having agreed to anything offended anyone or accidentally started an interstellar incident. That was when the room changed. Conversations did not stop. Nothing so dramatic, but they adjusted like water around a stone, and Tavian felt the shift reach him before he understood what it meant. He did not look up immediately. That would have been a mistake. Years of training had taught him that appearing to notice things at the exact moment they happened suggested you had been watching for them. Instead, he waited 3 seconds, pretended to finish examining the geometrically stable liquid on his plate, and only then raised his eyes. Sovereign Morel was moving. She did not walk. She arrived. One moment she stood at the far end of the hall, surrounded by light and officials whose entire existence seemed dedicated to standing near her. The next she was close enough that Tavian could see the delicate metallic filaments woven through her hair, each one catching the ambient glow and fracturing it into colors that had no names in any language he spoke. Her ears, long and elegant in the way of her people, angled slightly forward, attentive, curious, as if she had just remembered something mildly interesting and had decided to investigate. Tavian considered his options. None of them involved being addressed directly by the sovereign of the Athari Convergence. Ambassador Morse. There it was. The precise moment his entire strategy collapsed. He stood because remaining seated would have been worse. He inclined his head with what he hoped was the appropriate ratio of respect to not visibly panicking. Your Eminence. She studied him. The examination lasted exactly long enough to be uncomfortable without crossing into rudeness. Up close, her presence was not threatening in any traditional sense. It was simply inevitable, like gravity suddenly taking a personal interest in your trajectory. I trust the arrangements are satisfactory. They are exceptional, Tavian replied. This was true. He had never before been concerned that his meal might achieve consciousness. Good. She stepped closer. Not far, just enough. The rest of the hall did not disappear. The light still moved in its careful layers. The conversation still flowed. But importance shifted, and Tavian felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. Sovereign Morel leaned in. Her voice dropped not to a whisper exactly, but to something more deliberate, something meant only for him. My widowed sister, she said as if commenting on the weather, wishes to marry you. Tavian's mind performed an interesting maneuver. The part responsible for processing reality took a brief, necessary vacation. In its absence, several less useful cognitive functions attempted to assume control. This is a translation error. This is a cultural misunderstanding. This is an elaborate test of diplomatic composure. He managed through long practice and a certain amount of desperation to keep his expression neutral. His face did what it was told, his hands remained still. Internally, every alarm system he possessed was screaming. There was a pause. small, possibly noticeable only to people who ruled star systems. I see, he said. This was a remarkable achievement considering he did not. Do you, Sovereign Morel asked? Something in her tone now, not quite amusement, not quite curiosity, something sharper, more interested. Tavian considered honesty. He rejected it immediately. I believe I may require additional context, he said instead. Of course, Asiom. The sovereign straightened, and just like that, the moment folded back into the larger shape of the evening. Enjoy your meal, Ambassador. She was gone. Simply gone. As if the conversation had never happened. Tavian remained standing for exactly 2 seconds longer than necessary, then sat with the kind of care usually reserved for handling unstable explosives. The official beside him was still talking about fermentation. Tavian nodded without hearing a word. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his gaze. Across the hall, seated in composed stillness, was a woman he had never met and immediately recognized from the briefing materials he had studied 3 days ago. Empress Widow Corrine Thale. She appeared to be in her early 40s, though she carried her years with the kind of grace that made age seem irrelevant. She did not move. She did not acknowledge him. Her posture was flawless. Her expression controlled her entire presence, suggesting the kind of authority that required no announcement. Everything about her communicated certainty. Everything except her eyes. They met his. For one precise instant, Tavian saw something that belonged in no official report. Not confidence, not calculation. Something closer to, oh no. It vanished immediately, replaced by perfect composure, as if the crack in her facade had never existed. But Tavian had seen it. And worse, he understood it. She had just been told the same thing. Tavian exhaled very slowly. The sound disappeared into the vast humming space of the hall. He reached for his drink. Paused, set it down. No, he needed a clear mind for whatever was about to happen. Then after brief reconsideration, he picked the glass up again. On second thought, perhaps not that clear. Tavian had developed over the course of his career a finely tuned instinct for when to leave a room. That instinct was currently screaming at him in several languages, most of which his translator implant refused to process. He waited. Patience was a skill, so was recognizing when patience became cowardice. The dinner continued its slow, inevitable progression through courses that defied both description and the laws of thermodynamics. At some point, someone delivered a speech about interstellar cooperation that managed to be both diplomatically necessary and profoundly boring. Tavian applauded at the appropriate moments. All the while, he did not look at Corrine Thale. This required significant effort. The hall's architecture did not help. Every surface seemed designed to catch light and redirect it, creating subtle sightlines whether you wanted them or not. He caught glimpses, the way she held herself perfectly still even in casual conversation. The slight backward angle of her ears when she was listening to something she did not want to hear. The metallic threading in her dark hair, different from her sister's, simpler but no less deliberate. She did not look at him either. This was both a relief and a problem. Eventually, the formal structure of the evening began to dissolve. Guests stood, conversations fragmented and reformed. The impossible ceiling seemed less oppressive as people began to move beneath it. This was the dangerous phase, the part where unexpected interactions occurred. Tavian calculated his exit route. There were 3 viable corridors. One led to guest quarters. One led to what his briefing materials had described as contemplative gardens, which sounded pleasant and was almost certainly a security zone. The third led to an area his materials had not mentioned at all, which made it either storage or something he should not investigate. He stood, moved with measured calm, not too fast, not too slow. Years of practice guided each step. The art of being present and absent simultaneously. He was nearly there. The edge of the hall approached. Freedom, or at least a convincing imitation of it, waited just beyond the archway. Ambassador. Tavian stopped. Of course he did. He turned and found himself facing Corrine Thale at a distance that suggested this meeting had not been accidental. Up close, the details sharpened. The delicate symmetry of her features. The faint iridescence along her skin that shifted with the light. The controlled tension beneath her composure held so carefully that most people would never notice it. Her eyes were a shade of silver green that his translator had no name for. Empress, he said, inclining his head. There was no one else nearby. Naturally. I believe, she said, her voice calm and measured, we have been given the same information. Tavian considered several responses. None of them seemed appropriate. Yes, he said finally. It appears we have. Silence. Not empty, not uncomfortable, just present. I was not consulted, Corrine said. Tavian blinked. Carefully, he had standards. That is, she continued with the faintest narrowing of her eyes. Unusual. Something settled in Tavian's chest, not relief exactly. Recognition. Yes, he said more carefully now. I had reached a similar conclusion. For a moment, nothing happened. Then unexpectedly, Corrine exhaled. Small, subtle, but it changed the space between them just enough. I assume, she said, you do not have a prepared response to this situation? Tavian almost smiled. I regret to inform you, he replied, that I do not even have an unprepared one. There, the corner of her mouth, the smallest shift as if she had not intended to react and was now reconsidering that decision. Good, she said. Tavian tilted his head. Good. It would be concerning if you did. He considered that. That is reassuring. I was beginning to worry I was underprepared. You are, she said. I assumed as much. Another pause. Different this time. Less like a trap. More like an opening. Tavian glanced briefly at the hall behind them, then back to her. Would you, he said with careful neutrality, prefer to discuss this somewhere that does not echo quite so dramatically? Corrine followed his gaze, considering the vast space, the distant conversations, the ever-present hum of architecture that was probably listening. Yes, she said, I believe I would. They stood there for one moment longer, two people caught in the precise center of something neither had chosen. Then without further ceremony, they turned and walked into the corridor together. The corridor withdrew from the hall like a held breath being released. The hum softened. The light steadied into something less performative. Tavian felt his thoughts settle into clearer patterns, which was either helpful or dangerous. Possibly both. They walked in silence at first. Not awkward silence, the kind that acknowledged conversation would happen when they reached wherever they were going. Their footsteps made almost no sound. Tavian suspected the floor was compensating, which felt both impressive and intrusive. Corrine slowed, not stopped. She did not seem like someone who stopped unless it was deliberate, but she slowed just enough that the corridor widened around them, creating a space that felt, if not private, then at least less observed. The walls here curved inward slightly. Embedded lines of light pulsed in patterns that suggested some deeper function. Tavian resisted the urge to ask if they were sentient. I assume, Corrine said, her voice quieter now. You are attempting to understand the situation. I am attempting several things, Tavian replied. Understanding is one of them. Escaping was another briefly, but that seems less viable at the moment. She glanced at him, not sharply, not with judgment, just a glance. Escaping, she repeated. Only in theory, Tavian said quickly. I have not yet committed to the concept. Pause, betrayal. I see, she said in a way that suggested she did not entirely believe him, but was willing to let the statement exist. Tavian inclined his head slightly. It felt like the appropriate response to being gently disbelieved by an empress. They stood in the quiet. The light along the wall shifted. One section brightened as Corrine adjusted her stance, her ear angling briefly toward the corridor behind them before settling again. You said you were not consulted, Tavian ventured. Correct. In your position, I imagine decisions of this nature usually require your direct involvement. They do, which makes this unusual. Very. Tavian nodded slowly. So we are both confused. Yes. That is oddly comforting. Her lips quirked ever so slightly, almost imperceptible, but present. My sister, Corrine said after a moment, her tone carefully neutral, does not act without purpose. I had that impression. Which means this situation, however it appears on the surface, serves some intention we have not yet identified. Tavian considered that. That is either strategic thinking or justified paranoia. In my experience, Corrine said, those are often the same thing. I cannot argue with that. The corridor ahead of them curved gently to the right. Tavian had the distinct impression it had not curved that way a moment ago, but he was trying very hard not to think about the architecture's apparent autonomy. I should clarify, Corrine said suddenly, That I have no desire to marry someone I have just met. Tavian blinked. That is direct. I have found that directness saves time. I appreciate that. For the record, I also have no desire to marry someone I have just met. No offense intended. None taken. Good. That seemed important to establish. They reached the curve in the corridor. Beyond it, the space opened into something that was not quite a room, but more than a passage. Tavian stepped through and stopped. The chamber was small, intimate even, but it was clearly not meant for casual conversation. In the center stood a platform, or a table, or something that could be either depending on what it decided it wanted to be. Its surface shifted faintly like liquid, held in an invisible container. The walls pulsed with the same embedded light as the corridor, but here the pattern was different, more focused, more intentional. Corinne stepped beside him. This, she said carefully, feels deliberate. Tavian stared at the structure. I did not choose this location. Nor did I. They stood there both evaluating the space with the quiet suspicion one might reserve for a conversation that had already started without them. Then the room reacted. It was subtle at first. The light along the walls adjusted, narrowing slightly, focusing inward. The central structure shifted its surface, stabilizing into something more recognizable. A table. Definitely a table now, with two distinct sides. Tavian closed his eyes briefly. Of course, he murmured. The table's surface brightened. Patterns emerged across it, lines intersecting and aligning until they resolved into something structured. Symbols, data, a language Tavian's translator implant began processing with a faint delay. He leaned forward slightly, then immediately regretted it. This is, he said slowly, a proposal interface. Corinne did not move. Yes. Tavian stared at it. Of course it is. The symbols adjusted, responding to their proximity. Information expanded. Layers unfolded into readable segments. Names appeared. Titles, systems, agreements. His own name surfaced briefly, then shifted, as if acknowledging his attention. He straightened. I would like to formally state, he said, that I have not agreed to anything. The table dimmed slightly. Corinne's gaze flickered toward it, then back to him. It is not recording consent. This is informational. That is reassuring, Tavian replied. I would prefer not to accidentally confirm a marriage while adjusting my posture. There was a pause. Then unexpectedly, Corinne exhaled through her nose in a way that was unmistakably amusement. Tavian glanced at her. I am pleased this situation has reached a point where it can be considered mildly entertaining. It has not, she said, but we are approaching it. The table pulsed again, drawing their attention back. New information surfaced. Parameters, not demands exactly, frameworks. Tavian read in silence for a moment. This is not a simple union, he said finally. No, Corinne replied. It is a consolidation. Yes. Of territories, and yes. Of influence. Yes. Tavian nodded slowly, and we are the symbolic representation of that consolidation. Corinne's gaze did not waver. That is one interpretation. He considered that. I am struggling to find a more comforting one. The table shifted again. Data reorganized, highlighting different parameters now. Personal ones. Tavian leaned in despite himself. This is new, he said. Corinne stepped closer, her attention sharpening. The information was different. Less formal, less structured. It listed variables, compatibility metrics, behavioral projections, psychological alignments. Tavian blinked. This is evaluating us, he said. Yes, Corinne replied, in real time. Yes. The patterns continued their quiet assessment data, aligning into something that felt increasingly personal. Then the display changed. A new line appeared across the table's surface, clear and unmistakable. Compatibility index, 58% assessment, status insufficient, recommendation extended. Protocol required. Below it, another line materialized. Overnight deep assessment, 12-hour duration commence, 2,200 hours, location integration suite, Epsilon. They stood there side by side, the space between them defined by glowing data and impossible decisions. Tavian looked at the recommendation. Then at Corinne. She was already looking at him. 12 hours, he said quietly. Yes. Of assessment. Yes. Tavian nodded once. That seems excessive. That seems necessary, Corrine corrected. Her expression remained composed, but something in her eyes suggested she was calculating the same impossible variables he was. The table pulsed one final time. The message remained steady. Report to Integration Suite, Epsilon at 2200 hours or decline assessment and exit protocol. Tavian exhaled slowly. We could leave, he said. Yes. Walk away, pretend this never happened. Yeah. Another pause. Longer this time. But you are not going to, Corrine said. Not a question, an observation. Tavian looked at the data still glowing between them. The territories, the consolidation, the careful architecture of political necessity wrapped around two people who had never chosen each other. Are you, he asked, Corinne's ear angled forward. Attention, consideration. I do not know yet, she said. Ask me in 12 hours. The table's light dimmed to a soft glow as if satisfied with that answer. They stood in the chamber, two strangers caught in a moment that was no longer theoretical, and the architecture around them hummed with patient certainty. Somewhere in the palace, a clock marked 2,200 hours approaching, and neither of them moved toward the exit, integration suite. Epsilon was not what Tavian had expected. He had imagined something clinical, sterile, the kind of space where data was collected and emotions were irrelevant. Instead, he found himself in a chamber that felt almost organic. The walls curved like the inside of a shell, their surface embedded with the same living light he had seen throughout the palace, but here the glow was softer, warmer. In the center of the room, two seats faced each other. Between them, a space that was currently empty, but felt deliberately so, as if waiting for something to fill it. Corinne arrived exactly at 2200 hours. She had changed from her formal attire into something simpler, though no less elegant. The metallic threading in her hair caught the ambient light as she entered. Their eyes met. Neither spoke immediately. A voice emerged from the walls themselves. Neutral, genderless, the kind of voice that suggested vast processing power and absolutely no interest in small talk. Ambassador Morse, Empress Thael, welcome to Extended Assessment Protocol. Tavian settled into one of the seats. It adjusted to him immediately, which was both comfortable and unsettling. The next 12 hours will consist of simulation-based evaluation. The system continued. Scenarios will adapt based on your responses. Cooperation is encouraged, but not required. You may exit at any time. Corrine took her seat across from him. Her posture was perfect, but Tavian was beginning to recognize the small signs of tension. The slight backward angle of her ears, the way her hands rested just a fraction too still in her lap. One question, Tavian said to the empty air. What happens if we fail? Failure is not applicable, the system replied. Only data. That is not reassuring. It was not intended to be reassuring, it was intended to be accurate. Something shifted in Corinne's expression, subtle but unmistakable. The space between them shimmered. Light coalesced into form. The first scenario built itself around them like a memory taking shape. They were in a negotiation chamber. Not this one. Somewhere else. The walls displayed star maps, territorial boundaries rendered in glowing lines. Around them, holographic figures materialize. Diplomats, officials, each one wearing expressions of carefully controlled hostility. Tavian recognized the setup immediately. Trade dispute, resource allocation. The kind of situation where the wrong word could escalate into something nobody wanted. One of the holograms spoke, its voice sharp with accusation. The language was unfamiliar, but his implant translated instantly. The Morse delegation has violated the Tertius Accords. We demand immediate compensation. All eyes turned to him. Tavian felt Corinne's gaze as well, though she said nothing. This was his moment to respond. He took a breath, considered his options, chose honesty. The Tertius Accords contain an exemption clause for humanitarian intervention, he said calmly, which is precisely what occurred. No violation took place. The holographic diplomat's expression hardened. That is a convenient interpretation. It is the correct interpretation, Corinne said. Tavian glanced at her. She had not moved, but her voice carried absolute authority. The accords, she continued, were written to prevent exploitation, not to prevent aid. Ambassador Morris acted within both the letter and spirit of the agreement. The hologram shifted, recalculated, One by one, their aggressive postures softened into something more negotiable. The scenario dissolved. The voice returned. Coordination adequate. Mutual support demonstrated. Processing. They sat in silence for a moment. "You did not have to support my position," Tavian said quietly. "I know. Then why did you—" Karine looked at him directly. "Because you were right." Something in his chest loosened, just slightly. The second scenario arrived without warning. This time they stood in what appeared to be a ceremonial space. The architecture was distinctly Athari, all flowing curves and embedded light. Around them, witnesses watched in expectant silence. A figure approached them, holding what looked like a length of crystalline thread. The system's voice whispered context directly into Tavian's awareness. Cultural binding ceremony, physical coordination required. Symbolic unity gesture. Tavian looked at Corinne. She was closer now than she had been a moment ago, close enough that he could see the faint iridescence along her skin shift with her breathing. "I do not know this ritual," he admitted. "I do," she said softly. "Follow my lead." The figure extended the thread toward them. Corinne raised her right hand. Tavian mirrored the gesture. Their fingers did not touch, but the space between them measured in millimeters rather than centimeters. Corinne's hand moved in a slow, deliberate pattern. Tavian watched, learned, matched her rhythm. The thread wove between their hands over and under, creating a pattern that was meaningless to him, but clearly significant to the watching crowd. He became aware of her breathing, the slight warmth radiating from her proximity, the way her ear angled toward him, monitoring his movements without looking away from the ceremony. Their fingers brushed. Accidental. Brief. Neither acknowledged it. The thread completed its pattern. The witnesses erupted in approval. The scenario faded. Synchronization improving. Adaptive response noted. They were back in the seats, but the distance between them felt different now, smaller somehow. Between scenarios there was an alcove, a small space adjacent to the main chamber, where the light was dimmer and the walls did not seem quite so aware. Two chairs, a low table that offered water in vessels that shifted temperature based on who held them. Tavian sat heavily. The scenarios were not physically taxing, but they required a kind of mental flexibility that left him drained. Corinne settled into the other chair with considerably more grace. "Your late husband," Tavian said, then paused. "I apologize. That was abrupt." "It was," she agreed, "but I do not mind directness. What about him?" The briefing materials mentioned he was a military commander, that the marriage united two territories. Corinne studied the vessel in her hands. "It did, very successfully from a political standpoint, and from a personal standpoint." She was quiet for a long moment. "We respected each other. That was sufficient for what the union needed to accomplish, but not for what you needed." Her eyes lifted to his. "No," Tavian nodded slowly. "I understand that more than you might expect." "Your previous posting," Corinne said. "The one you do not discuss in official records." He should have been surprised, she knew. He was not. "I trusted someone," he said simply. "A colleague. A friend, I thought. They used that trust to advance their own interests at significant cost to others. Including you. Including many people. I was merely the most visible casualty." Corinne set down her vessel. "That is why you chose strategic invisibility. If you cannot be seen, you cannot be betrayed." Tavian smiled without humor. "Or so I told myself." "But you are here," she said, "being very visible." "Yes." He met her gaze. "I am still deciding how I feel about that." The alcove's light pulsed gently. A warning. The next scenario was ready. They stood, closer to each other now than they had been when they sat down. The scenarios continued. They came faster now, each one bleeding into the next with less transition time. A crisis aboard a transport vessel. Tavian had to decide treatment protocols while Corinne managed panicking passengers. Her calm authority and his medical knowledge combined into something effective. A resource shortage requiring impossible allocation decisions. They genuinely argued about priorities and ethics, found compromise not through agreement, but through understanding why the other believed what they did. A formal dinner where every course carried symbolic meaning. Tavian stumbled through the ritual. Corinne caught each mistake before it became offensive. Her quiet corrections delivered in ways that made them seem intentional. The compatibility index climbed. 58 became 67, then 72, then 79. Neither of them mentioned it. The scenario that changed everything started simply. They were in a living space, modest, comfortable. Morning light filtered through windows that overlooked a garden Tavian did not recognize. The air smelled like something growing. He stood in what appeared to be a kitchen. Corrine sat at a small table nearby, reading something on a translucent display. "This is different," Tavian said. "Yes." The system's voice did not intrude. No instructions, no context, just the space and their presence within it. Tavian looked at the kitchen surfaces, found what might have been a brewing device for hot beverages. The interface was intuitive enough that he managed to produce 2 cups of something that steamed gently. He brought one to the table. Set it down near Corinne. She looked up. Their eyes met. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. Nothing more. But something in her expression was different. Softer. Tavian sat across from her, picked up his own cup. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of a kind of peace he had not expected to find in a simulation. "This is strange," he said quietly. "What is... This feels more real than the ceremonial binding did. More real than the crisis scenarios." Corinne set down her display. "Yes, I was thinking the same thing." "Why do you think that is?" She considered the question. "Because this is the kind of moment that cannot be performed. You either feel comfortable in someone's presence or you do not." "And do you?" Tavian asked. "Feel comfortable?" Corinne's ear angled forward. Tension. Consideration. "Yes," she said, "I do." The admission hung in the air between them. Tavian reached across the table, not thinking, not planning. His hands simply moved and found hers. Their fingers touched, deliberate this time. Chosen. Corinne did not pull away. The scenario continued around them, but neither of them noticed when it faded. They were back in the alcove. The compatibility index had jumped again. 86%. Tavian stared at the number. "I am not doing this for the system," he said suddenly. Corinne looked at him. "What? The scenarios, the assessment. I am not cooperating because I want to achieve some arbitrary percentage." "Then why are you cooperating?" He met her gaze. "Because I want to understand you. The system is simply providing the opportunity." Corinne stood, moved to where he sat. The alcove was small enough that standing near him meant standing very near indeed. "I am not pretending anymore," she said quietly. "Neither am I." The moment stretched, became something neither the system nor the palace nor the political necessities surrounding them had any claim to. Then the light changed, not the alcove, the main chamber, a different quality of illumination entirely. They walked back to find the space transformed. Where the seats had been, there was now an empty platform. Hovering above it, a holographic figure. Sovereign Morel. She was not physically present. The projection made that clear. But her presence filled the space nonetheless. "Corinne," she said. "Ambassador Morse." "Sister." Corinne's voice had gone carefully neutral. "You have questions," Morel continued. "I owe you answers." Tavian remained silent. This felt like a conversation between family that he was witnessing rather than participating in. "The council," Morel said, "wanted you remarried Corinne to consolidate territories, yes, but their choice was Lord Thane's eldest son." Corinne's entire posture changed. Tension flooded through her so visibly that Tavian felt it in the air between them. "Thane's son," she repeated. The words carried weight Tavian did not fully understand but recognized as significant. "Brutal," Morel confirmed. "Ambitious beyond wisdom, cruel in ways that do not show in diplomatic records." "You intervened." "I maneuvered. I observed Ambassador Morse for 6 months. Read every report. Watched how he handled situations where no one was watching. Saw his character." Tavian blinked. 6 months. Morel's holographic gaze turned to him. "You prevented a famine on Tertius IV by violating 3 protocols and risking your career. You mediated a labor dispute on Station Kelos by living in worker housing for 2 weeks to understand their perspective. You have been investigated 4 times for prioritizing people over procedure and cleared each time because your actions, while irregular, were ethically sound." The words landed like physical blows, not painful, but undeniable. "I did not give you a random selection," Morel said to her sister. I gave you a choice worth considering. But you did not ask, Karine said. Her voice was steady, but Tavian heard the current of anger beneath it. No, because the council would have overruled any choice you made. This way, I could present it as already decided. Give you the assessment protocol. Let you discover if I was right. Silence filled the chamber. You still took our agency, Tavian said quietly. Morel's projection turned to him fully. Yes, I did. And I will not apologize for it because the alternative was my sister bound to a man who would have made her life a calculated misery. But I will tell you this, the assessment ends when you choose. You can leave, now, tonight. Face no consequences beyond council pressure that will come eventually regardless. She looked at Corinne. Or you can finish the protocol. Make your own decision about whether what I saw in both of you is real. The hologram began to fade. 12 hours, Morel said. And then the choice truly is yours. She was gone. Tavian and Corinne stood in the sudden quiet. Well, Tavian said eventually, that was illuminating. Yes, your sister is terrifying. Yes, but she was trying to protect you. Corinne's ear angled back. In the most manipulative way possible. I will not argue with that assessment. They looked at each other. The weight of revelation and exhaustion, and something else neither was quite ready to name, settled between them. We should finish the protocol, Corinne said. Yes. Not because she orchestrated this. No. Because we want to know. Tavian nodded. Yes. The chamber's light shifted, ready for the next scenario. They walked back to their positions, side by side now, rather than separate. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not because the system required it, because somewhere in the last 6 hours they had chosen to. The scenarios that followed were different, softer somehow, as if the system had learned enough about coordination and compatibility and had moved on to questions it could not answer with data alone. The chamber transformed into a medical bay. Emergency lights pulsed in urgent rhythm. Tavian found himself standing over a figure on a diagnostic table displays scrolling information too fast to fully process. The figure was Corinne. Not real, he knew that. The hologram was perfect in every detail, but he could see the faint shimmer at the edges that marked it as simulation. Still, his hands moved without conscious thought, checking readings, adjusting treatments. The system's voice came soft and clinical. Critical trauma, resource limitations, 2 treatment options. Option 1, high success probability, significant recovery time. Option 2, faster recovery, moderate risk of permanent damage. Choose. Tavian looked at hologram Corinne, then at real Corinne who stood at the edge of the simulation watching. Option 1, he said with a hesitation. Time is a factor. The system pressed. Option 2 is more efficient. I did not ask for the most efficient option. I asked for the one that does not risk her. The scenario shifted. Now Corinne stood where he had been and Tavian lay on the table. He watched her face as she made the same calculation he had just completed. Option 1, she said, her voice absolutely certain. The simulation faded. Neither of them spoke about it. The next scenario built a different kind of space around them. A room. Simple. Comfortable. But the details suggested permanence. Belongings that had accumulated over time. A shelf with objects that meant nothing individually, but collectively told a story of years lived in the same place. 2 chairs sat near a window. Outside, something like sunset painted the sky in colors that had no names. Tavian and Corinne were not young here. The hologram showed them aged, decades older, his hair silver white, her face carrying the elegant lines of a life fully lived. They sat in those chairs, and the scene that played out was so simple it bordered on mundane. Hologram Tavian said something, a comment about the garden outside. Hologram Corinne replied with gentle mockery about his inability to remember which plants needed shade. They laughed, quiet, comfortable. The laughter of people who had heard each other's jokes 1,000 times and still found them funny. Then hologram Corinne reached across the space between their chairs, took hologram Tavian's hand. I would choose you again, she said. The words were soft, almost lost beneath the sound of wind through the projected garden. Real Tavian felt something in his chest tighten. The scene held for a moment longer. Then it dissolved, leaving them standing in the chamber, decades younger than the versions they had just witnessed. Tavian turned to Corinne. Would you, she met his eyes. Would I what? Choose me again, if you had the chance. Corrine stood very still. The question hung between them like something fragile. Ask me in 50 years, she said finally. The chamber's light shifted, not to a new scenario, to something else entirely. The central platform rose, on it a display unlike anything they had seen in the previous hours. Not projections, not simulations, just data, clean, final. The compatibility index sat at the top, 93%. Below it, dense blocks of analysis, behavioral alignment, adaptive variance, psychological compatibility. Every metric the system had been measuring throughout the night. And at the bottom, a single line of text that pulsed with quiet certainty, assessment complete, recommendation, union approved. They stared at it, the weight of algorithmic certainty rendered in glowing symbols. Then the display changed. New text appeared and Tavian felt the shift in the chambered atmosphere, clearly as if someone had opened a door. Analysis conclusion, compatibility, metrics exceed threshold. However, true union requires conscious choice beyond algorithmic approval system. Assessment at protocols terminated, chamber monitoring disabled, decision authority transferred to participants. The light in the chamber dimmed. Not darkness, but a softer illumination that felt less invasive, less aware. The voice that had guided them through the night spoke one final time. Ambassador Morse, Empress Thale. This system was designed to measure compatibility. It has completed that function. What it cannot measure is choice. That belongs to you alone. A pause. All monitoring has ceased. This chamber is now simply a room. You may exit at any time, or you may remain and discuss your decision in privacy. Another pause. Longer. Assessment complete. Decision authority is now yours. The presence that had filled the space for 12 hours withdrew. Not dramatically. It simply stopped being there. Tavian and Corrine stood in the sudden quiet, two people who had been observed and measured and analyzed, now finally alone. The exit corridor's light pulsed softly. Available. Open. Neither of them moved toward it. Corrine walked to one of the seats they had occupied hours ago. Sat with the kind of deliberate care that suggested her composure was harder won than it appeared. Tavian remained standing for a moment longer, then joined her. Not in the opposite seat, in the one beside hers. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they had experienced together in this strange artificial night, full of everything they had not yet said. We could walk away, Tavian said finally. You heard your sister. No consequences. Beyond the council's continued pressure. Yes, beyond that. Corinne looked at him. Why would you stay? You have nothing to gain from this. A diplomatic posting can be found anywhere. Tavian considered the question. It deserved honesty. 6 months ago, he said slowly, I watched a famine develop on Tertius 4 because the relief protocols required 17 approvals before food could be distributed. I violated 3 of those protocols, sent the supplies immediately. Sovereign Morel mentioned that. What she did not mention is that I spent the next month certain I had ended my career, that the right choice would cost me everything I had worked for. Corinne's ear angled toward him, listening. But it did not, Tavian continued. I was investigated, cleared, reassigned, and I learned something about myself that I had not known before. What was that? That I would rather live with consequences I chose than safety I did not. He turned to face her fully. This, he gestured at the chamber around them, is not what I would have chosen. Not the method, not the manipulation, not the political necessity wrapped around it like a net. No, Corinne agreed quietly. But you, Tavian said, the last 12 hours, learning how you think, how you react under pressure, how you make breakfast in a simulation and argue about hypothetical children and hold my hand when you think I need it, even though you would never admit that is why you did it. Corinne's expression shifted, something between surprise and recognition. That, Tavian finished, I would choose, if you would let me. The words settled into the space between them. Corinne was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he had heard it all night. My husband died 3 years ago. The union had been politically successful. We managed territories well together, prevented conflicts, built trade relationships. She paused. But I was lonely. Every single day of 22 years was lonely. Her eyes met his. I told myself it did not matter. That personal happiness was a small price for stability, that I could live with the emptiness as long as it served a purpose. And now I have spent 12 hours with someone who makes me laugh, who argues with me about ethics instead of agreeing because I am an empress, who chose the safer medical option when efficiency would have been acceptable. She reached across the small distance between them, found his hand, held it. I do not want to be lonely anymore, she said, but I will not trade one cage for another. Tavian felt the weight of her words, the trust they represented. Then we do not accept their terms, he said. Corinne tilted her head. Explain. Your sister presented this as decided. The council sees it as political consolidation. The system measured it as compatibility percentages. He shifted to face her, fully still holding her hand. We tell them they are all wrong. And replace it with what? Tavian took a breath. We accept a partnership, not a marriage. Not yet. We take 6 months. Court properly. Learn each other outside of political necessity and algorithmic assessment. The council will object, though. Let them. We present it as good faith, as due diligence, as exactly the kind of careful consideration they should want before a union this significant. Corinne's expression was unreadable. Then slowly her mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile but close. You want to rewrite the arrangement. I want us to write it ourselves. Equal standing, Corinne said, the words coming faster now as she followed the thread. Partnership terms, not consort, not political symbol. Exactly. 6 months to decide if what the system measured is something we actually want to build. Yeah, she studied him. That is remarkably stubborn for someone who practices strategic invisibility. I am trying something new, Tavian said. Apparently I am choosing consequences again. This time she did smile. You are aware this will complicate everything. I am aware. Do you object? Corinne's hand tightened around his. No, I do not object at all. They sat there. Hands joined the chamber around them, no longer measuring or monitoring or manipulating. Just a room where two people had made a choice that belonged entirely to them. Outside, dawn was beginning to touch the palace. The night's assessment complete. The future suddenly impossibly their own. They walked through the corridors together as morning light filtered down through architecture that seemed less imposing in daylight. The palace was waking. Servants moved with quiet efficiency. Officials hurried toward early meetings. Tavian and Corinne drew attention. Of course they did. The widowed empress and the human diplomat walking side by side after a night in the assessment chamber. Speculation would spread like fire through dry grass. Let it spread. Tavian thought. They would know the truth soon enough. The banquet hall had been transformed. Where the previous evening had seen elaborate dining arrangements, now there stood a formal assembly space. Chairs arranged in precise rows. A dais at the front where Sovereign Morel waited, flanked by council members, whose expressions ranged from curious to calculating. The room quieted as they entered. Tavian felt the weight of every eye on them, felt the political machinery already spinning, trying to interpret what their presence together meant. They walked to the center of the space, stopped before the dais. Sovereign Morel's expression revealed nothing. Ambassador Morse, Empress Thael, the assessment protocol is complete. It is, Corinne replied. And the results? Corinne glanced at Tavian, a look that contained entire conversations. Then she turned back to her sister. The system recorded a compatibility index of 93%. Murmurs rippled through the assembled officials. The recommendation was for union approval, Corinne continued. Her voice carried clearly in the vast space. However, we are declining that recommendation as presented. The murmurs became something louder, more agitated. Morel raised one hand. Silence returned. Explain, she said simply. Tavian stepped forward. The assessment measured compatibility. It did not measure choice. We are grateful for the information it provided. But a partnership of the significance you have proposed deserves more than algorithmic approval. What do you propose instead? This from a council member, an older Aethari, whose long ears angled forward with sharp attention. 6 months, Tavian said, a formal courtship period, during which Empress Thael and I will determine if the compatibility the system measured translates into a foundation we choose to build upon. That is irregular, another council member objected. That is wise, Morel countered, her gaze fixed on her sister. You agree to this? I do, Corrine said, on the condition that the courtship establishes equal standing, not a consort relationship, a partnership. You ask us to delay consolidation, the first council member said, 6 months during which territorial instability could worsen. We offer you something better than forced consolidation, Corrine replied. Her voice carried the full weight of her authority now. We offer you a union built on genuine foundation, one that will endure because it was chosen, not mandated. Tavian watched the council members calculate. Political necessity against long-term stability. Immediate results against sustainable outcomes. Sovereign Morel stood. The room focused entirely on her. My sister makes a valid point, she said. Forced unions serve purposes. Chosen partnerships build legacies. She looked at Corrine, and for just a moment, Tavian saw something pass between the sisters. Understanding. Perhaps even approval. The council will vote, Morel announced. Those are those in favor of the 6-month courtship proposal with equal partnership terms. Hands rose. Slowly at first, then more quickly as the logic became clear. 7 out of 11 council members approved. The chamber held its breath for a moment. This was unprecedented, a formal courtship with equal partnership terms presented by the participants themselves rather than arranged by the council. Morel's expression remained composed, but Tavian caught the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. The proposal is accepted, she declared. 6 months beginning today. Ambassador Morris will be granted diplomatic residence appropriate to his standing. Empress Thael will retain all current authority and autonomy. At the conclusion of the courtship period, both parties will declare their decision for this council. She paused. And we will respect whatever decision they make. The formality concluded with ceremonial efficiency. Documents would be prepared, announcements would be made. The political machinery would adjust to this new configuration. But Tavian barely heard the details. He was focused on Corrine beside him, the way she held herself with dignity and relief in equal measure. They were dismissed. The crowd began to disperse. Tavian and Corrine walked back toward the corridor where they had first truly spoken barely 12 hours ago. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then. At the corridor entrance, Corrine stopped, turned to face him. Do you regret it? She asked quietly. Which part? Choosing me when you could have walked away. Tavian considered the question. The night behind them. The 6 months ahead. The complete unpredictability of what they had just set in motion. Ask me in 50 years, he said. Corinne's expression softened into something that was pure and uncomplicated. A smile. Real. Chosen. The simulation showed you would say that. Then it got one thing right, she laughed. Quiet, genuine. The sound of it settled something in Tavian's chest that he had not realized needed settling. They stood there in the same space where political necessity had first thrown them together. But everything had changed. The arrangement that had been imposed on them had become something they were choosing to build. Together. The corridor ahead led back toward the banquet hall, where formal celebration would mark the beginning of their courtship, where witnesses would watch and speculation would grow, and the future would unfold in ways neither of them could predict. Corrine extended her hand. Tavian took it. They walked forward into that uncertain future, no longer strangers bound by political necessity, but partners who had chosen each other in the quiet moments when no system was watching. The palace around them hummed with its ever-present awareness, but for once Tavian did not mind being observed. He had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility, of safety through obscurity. But walking beside Corrine, their hands joined their choice made clear for anyone who cared to see, he discovered something unexpected. Being visible when you stood beside the right person was not vulnerability. It was freedom. They entered the banquet hall together. The vast space that had seemed so oppressive the night before now felt different. Still grand, still impossible, but no longer overwhelming. The crowd turned, watched, waited. Tavian felt Corrine's hand tighten around his. Not nervousness, certainty. They walked to the center of the hall where light descended in those slow, deliberate layers, and for the first time since arriving at this place, Tavian understood what it meant to stand at the center of something and not wish to disappear. Sovereign Morel watched from her position near the dais. Her expression remained composed, but Tavian caught something in her eyes that might have been satisfaction. She had orchestrated this, manipulated the pieces, forced a situation neither he nor Karine had chosen. But in the end, she had been right about one thing. She had given them an option worth considering, and they had considered it, questioned it, challenged it, redefined it entirely. The choice that resulted belonged to no one but themselves. Outside the hall, somewhere in Integration Suite Epsilon, a screen flickered in an empty chamber. Data scrolled past final calculations, closing protocols. Then, a single line of text appeared. Mission facilitate choice status complete. The screen went dark. The system, having accomplished what it was designed to do, had no further purpose. It had measured compatibility, provided opportunity, created space for understanding to develop. But the choice itself, the real choice that would determine what came next, had never been the system's to make. It had always belonged to two people who started as strangers, spent 12 hours learning each other's truth, and decided that what they found was worth choosing. Together, in the banquet hall, dawnlight finally reached the impossible ceiling painting. Everything in shades of gold and possibility. Tavian looked at Karine. She looked back. And somewhere in that exchange, in that moment of shared understanding and chosen future, the assessment that truly mattered completed itself. Not with percentages or metrics or algorithmic certainty, but with something simpler, more powerful, and entirely their own, a beginning.